from one's physical health to their mental and emotional state, specifically in regards to teachers and other school officials. What does proper educator well-being look like to you? What steps can be taken to achieve this? And we will start with Isaiah.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. Um, when I think about the steps, I think about first relational trust and this idea of care. Relationships is everything. And when it comes to admin and teachers, we want to think about ongoing supports for systems of feedback development, channels of feedback, transparency, but creating safe and healthy spaces that actually build strong culture. Inside of this idea of relational trust is care, and care is at the bedrock of the work we do. Folks like Nell Noddings talked about, care being the fundamental foundation of our morality. Bell Hooks even talked about care. If you care for the souls of your learners, then everything will be okay, because then we can take care of each other. And that is not just students, right? It is very much so transferable for all learners, students at the teacher level, and even for leaders, because they're teachers of teachers that continue to learn. And so some of that work is through care, and care and content are not mutually exclusive, but I'll talk about that later.
Thank you. We'll go, oh yes, so we'll go to Dr. Montgomery, and then Ashley, and then Dr. Okoya.
I reflected on my years of teaching and what that was for me. And I think I was a really good teacher. But when I think about what it took to be a good teacher, I used to be proud of it. And today I'm somewhat ashamed to say that it took much more work and much more overtime and much more physical and mental capacity than anyone should probably be expected to give to their career, and the cost it takes for your family. The summers I spent planning and prepping, as in addition to the time during the week that I was planning and prepping, and announcing proudly I have a teacher bladder, or even to this day, going out to eat and eating so fast that, those things are things that we don't really think about, that sometimes we have the nerve to be proud of, and somehow we have to shift our thinking around what's acceptable and not acceptable. And there are things that I think we expect from our educators that we don't expect from other sectors. And until we really deal with that and stop being the martyrs of the world around, what is expected of us as educators, I think we won't see much change. And so when we think about, when I'm mentoring principals and I'm saying to them, take a 30-minute lunch, and they say, oh, I can't take lunch. Who says that? And in what world is that really okay? And it's funny because every time I say it, everybody smiles and they nods and they know that this is true. But yet, does the general public know what it takes to actually be an educator, what you're sacrificing? And those things are unhealthy. How many of us have had a bladder infection? Just simple things like that are real health issues that we're not really dealing with. And so for me, the wellness for our educators really begins with recognizing the sacrifices and putting in place structures in the districts and in the school systems that support wellness, that actually say, no, it's actually not okay that you don't get more than 30 minutes to digest and eat your food. No, it's not okay that you don't have a break, especially elementary educators, if you have recess duty. Those things aren't okay. And systems need to start building that into their structure of the day, the structure of how we work. Most of the data shows that teachers leave the profession due to working conditions. These are working conditions that everybody says are okay. So the ones that are making them leave, you're like, whoa, what could that actually be? And I think if we look at our youngs that are going to become teachers, they are definitely not going to put up with this, and they are not want to become teachers. So we have to do some things differently structurally at the policy level, the district policy level, and inside, just the whole procedures and processes of organizations as a whole. And I think it's just overall society, but when we think about educators in particular, I think there's more. And every time there's a deficit in society, teachers need to teach that. Teachers need to teach that. We just want to keep adding on what educators do without thinking about well-being. So we definitely have to put some structural things in place.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Dr. Montgomery. And so when I think about well-being, I think about a couple of different facets to this, especially in the workplace. And I think part of it means feeling like your work is sustainable, that the expectations for your work are realistic, and that you have the supports that you need in order to feel successful. And I think that this is also embodied by some of the indicators for well-being that we use in our research to explore the state of teachers' well-being, like our indicators of burnout and the frequency of job-related stress and how teachers are coping with that stress. And connecting very much to what Isaiah was talking about earlier, I think another aspect of this is also what kind of environments are teachers working in, and how does that make them feel? Do they feel safe? Do they feel as though they belong? And do they have connection and relationships with the people that are around them? And I'm sure we'll be getting into the many ways that we can support teacher well-being. But in short, I think that we can look at it from a couple of different vantage points. I think one, also speaking to what Dr. Montgomery was just saying, I think we can actually think about how we can improve teachers and principals' working conditions and alleviate the sources of their stress in order to support well-being. So in other words, this means giving them the resources and the supports they need in order to do their jobs well and more easily, thinking about where we can take things off their plates and provide them opportunities to plan for their work, to focus on the core tasks of instructing students, for teachers or for supporting teachers with instruction, for principals, and also allowing them the opportunity to rest. And I think another facet of it is thinking about how we can support well-being by giving them these well-being supports that are targeted towards their mental health and wellness. So thinking about how teaching and leading is probably always going to be stressful to some extent. As a former teacher myself, I've always thought of teaching as work that kind of uniquely requires a combination of intellectual skills and knowledge, emotional skills, social skills, and requires you to be physical and on your feet all day. And so how can we give teachers the well-being supports that are really tailored to what they would find useful, and do it in a way that's not just like a one-off, but is truly embedded in the way that schools and districts work?
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm trying to make sure that what I say is additive because I want to punctuate everything that everyone said. But I think it really does come down to culture in schools, right? So in schools, we don't really use the word working conditions, we use culture. And that's because schools are not seen as workplaces, they're seen as learning centers. And they're both, right? They're places where people both learn and also a place where people work. So we haven't really applied a lot of the workplace wellness practices to schools in the way that other workplaces have. And, I think corporations and nonprofits have a long way to go, but there has been a longer standing emphasis on well-being of employees, and there has been on the well-being of teachers. And so thinking about culture and what it takes to shift culture, we use in our work with schools this framework of helping schools shift towards a culture of community care, where there's time and space to look at each other, connect, and to support each other the way that we need to be supported. And we use Gert Hofstede's model of culture that includes symbols, heroes, and rituals, and help them really examine what are the symbols, heroes, and rituals in our system that promote or counter community care. So for example, if the heroes of our school are people who stay late and never spend time with their families, are missing every soccer game, and those are the heroes of our system, versus the person who has good boundaries and is a good teacher and, exercises and spends time with their family. If those are the heroes of our system, then we're more likely to promote a culture of community care and one that promotes well-being. And similarly, like for our rituals, when we start a staff meeting, are we immediately getting to the agenda and talking about kids? Or are we looking at people and saying, what's one word to describe how you're feeling, and actually like tending to that feeling, and maybe shifting our agenda a little bit if folks' mood seems a little bit off, and still getting to our objective, but having fewer objectives for our meetings, and building in these opportunities to connect and heal and see each other and support each other in our existing spaces so that it doesn't feel like additive work. So I'd say that well-being, like I think all of us touched on, that has to do so much with culture and context and the environment in which we're working and students are learning, and then we're all learning, growing, and connecting together.
I love how you made the point about the heroes of the school and, the modeling that behavior and how that sets a tone, and how important language is. And thinking about this, as all of you have mentioned, it's about the culture, and how that culture creates those conditions that often lead to our teachers leaving the field, especially those who are people of color. Our next question is going to be related to policy. As you know, the Hunt Institute, named after four-term North Carolina Governor Hunt, who championed educational equity, we work a lot with policymakers in this space. So this is for Ashley and Isaiah, and we will start with Ashley for this question. A recent report from RAND about teacher and principal well-being found that properly supporting students' academic learning and staffing issues are top sources of stress. What recommendations would you have for policymakers to support teachers and school leaders in this space?
Yeah, and so what I think this finding reflects is that during the second full year of the pandemic, and as we are emerging from remote learning and transitioning back to in-person learning, principals and teachers were really focusing on trying to get back to the core elements of their job. So teaching kids and making sure that schools are staffed so that kids can learn. And of course, principals' stress with regards to staffing is also very relevant to the time that we're currently in, and also very relevant to the time that our principals fielded, which was at the height of the Omicron surge. And so this leads to some of our recommendations around supporting teachers and principals to focus on their core job responsibilities. When we ask teachers and principals who are thinking about leaving, what would they need in order to consider staying in their jobs, focusing on their core job responsibilities, and also working fewer hours per week were some of the top ranked factors named by teachers and principals. And especially during the pandemic, teachers and principals were tasked with so many additional responsibilities, like enforcing COVID mitigation measures or taking up extra work in the wake of staffing shortages, or helping students cope with the stresses and trauma of the pandemic. And so we should focus on providing them with the supports to do their jobs better. So for teachers, this might be things like more planning time, or providing more staff like teaching assistants or paras or counselors or others who can help provide behavioral and emotional supports for students. And for principals, supports might include expedited hiring processes, or even more investments in long-term strategies to develop local talent to help fill in staffing shortages over the long run. And I also want to point out that supporting teachers' mental health is actually one of principals' major stressors. And so to the extent that leaders and policymakers could support teacher well-being, that would actually alleviate a big source of stress for principals too.
Thank you, Ashley.
Ashley, I agree with everything you said. I would also, earlier, Ashley, you spoke about like a set of skills, and I think Dr. Montgomery specifically spoke about a mindset shift in order to do this work. I think creating access to, as well as internalizing the supports that an organization or district has or does not have. I'm going back to this care and culture piece or care and content piece, because I think a lot of times as educators, and Dr. Montgomery hit this earlier, I got to get this lesson plan done. This is due at this particular time. Everything seems so tactical, almost transactional, right? And we're moving away from this transformative work. And so the other part about this work is not just knowing the lesson plan, but understanding the curriculum of your children, your community. the people within the space and in the building. And I think we have to kind of redefine what success and what this actually is. During the pandemic, as a school leader, there was no playbook for me. there was no one to tell me to do it this way, because we were making it up. And so what I knew was my biggest stress was to retain people. How do I retain people? And then also, how do I create a successful bench, so if people do leave, I have people in-house that I can roll and create into and push into teacher positions. And so one of the things that we've done in the past is create a pipeline program for educators of color. It was called an instructional assistant program. And to Ashley, your point earlier, you mentioned, getting people from the community. A lot of the people who came into my building who were instructional assistants were from the community, or a former Division I football player who heard from another teacher, hey, come to KPPA because they're doing all these things. But it was really keeping your ear to the ground and really understanding care. The curriculum of your people is at the forefront, and it is the bedrock of the work that we do. Once you got that piece, it creates that positive culture that everyone on this call is talking about, which creates strong retention and people stay. So I would advise, policymakers to create more programs to give access to
I
folks.
think that you froze some and your sound was a little distorted. The last thing we heard was positive culture.
Oh, create positive culture and create programs to not just retain, but to also create more teachers. There are so many people who want to teach but don't have access to get into these programs. And so how do you create transition or pipeline programs to not just retain, but make a sustainable work environment, so people are not overworked and overstressed, and people are actually there because they want to do the work.
I do love your mention of those, pipelines and access. The Hunt Institute is fortunate enough to be one of 7 other partners that leads our 1 million Teachers of Color work, which also works with increasing the number of leaders of color, but really thinking about that community aspect that we've seen in some of the Grow Your Own programs, as well as programs that pull people from those communities, so that not only are they familiar with the experience that students are having, but they're giving back to a place that's important. And also looking beyond just like what our traditional networks might be, finding those entry points, that's so important. So I really like that you both spoke to the community aspect, then also just how do you help principals and leaders support teachers, and how do they also themselves have support? Which leads us to our next question. Dr. Montgomery and Dr. Okoya both lead organizations that are focused on educator diversity, support. And so I'd love for both of you to talk a little bit about how is your organization supporting and promoting access to resources that affirm educator wellness and well-being. And we will start with Dr. Okoya.
I love this question because I feel like it's an honor and privilege to be able to provide resources directly to educators that support their well-being, because I needed them. And I don't know if you feel the same way, Dr. Montgomery, when I was a classroom teacher. So the main way that we support educator well-being is by providing healing circles. And I'll describe them because folks always say, I kind of know what that is, but I'm not sure exactly what that is. But healing circles come from Indigenous practices, and they're a research-backed peer-to-peer mental health intervention, which is shown to improve quality of life and mental health outcomes with an ideal dose of 4 healing circles. And so we have trained restorative facilitators who go into schools either virtually or in person and start with a mindfulness moment with educators, and then guide them through a series of restorative questions that facilitate the connection that all of us were talking about. So teachers are talking to each other about things like, what are our dreams? What stops us from dreaming? Or what boundaries do we need to set in place? And then they close the conversation with both a shared commitment and an individual commitment to uphold what it says that they were going to do during the circle. And what happens in those spaces is really beautiful. People share things with the group that they've never shared before. They learn things about their colleagues. One of the schools that we're working with brought us in because the principal said, I have a staff of 114 teachers. And last year we were like saying goodbye. And I saw one teacher asking someone else, what's her name? And my staff members like really just didn't even know each other. So the pandemic has only expanded the isolation in the education community in our world at large, but schools there are really a lot of opportunities for connection there. So we're able to provide space for folks to connect and heal in those healing circles. And even the skeptics in the end see it as valuable. And almost about 93% of folks say that they intend to apply the practices that they gain in the healing circles in the 3 months that follow. So that's something that we're able to do and kind of our main offering to intervene on well-being.
Thank you. Dr. Montgomery?
Yeah, so, our work, just as equitable practices, culturally responsive, revitalizing and uplifting practices should not be like a stand aside or something you do extra. Neither should well-being practices. It should all be woven into what we do. And so in our work, we weave those strategies into our professional development and our coaching strategies that we use in our educators to ensure that they're centering themselves and they're really taking care of themselves before they are thinking about how they're caring for their students and families, which is really important. Creating a culture of care is also about ensuring that everyone feels valued and welcomed and supported in the space. We think about our educators and leaders of color specifically. We're thinking about how they're being welcomed and supported in these spaces as well. And so we're helping educators understand how to do that, not only for their students, but also for each other. And so we're really committed to ensuring that educators are thinking about how they're taking some self-care practices. And so doing individual coaching with leaders, we're saying, tell me one thing you're going to do for yourself today. Tell me one thing you're going to do that is going to take care of yourself this weekend. But always asking them those questions in every single session so that they understand it should be something that they're thinking about all the time. We model those things in our work as well. When we are providing professional development and workshops, we are really ensuring that we provide space for human connectedness, that we provide space for folks to really step back and think about how they're feeling, getting in touch with the stressors that are occurring every day, which is really, really important. And lastly, we partner with folks like organizations that are similar to what Dr. Okoya is talking about. We partner with an organization called the Teaching Well. And that's their focus is also on that. And so sometimes you have to step back and let others step forward in this work. And so we really make sure that we connect them with organizations that can focus more on that, while we also ensure that we're focusing on how to make the environment and building a culture of care within the organizations that we lead. And I think it's important for us also to do advocacy and to really focus with our policymakers, both at the local level and at the state level, to ensure that these changes are being made, and really that they're implementing those strategies across the system. And then we also, as an organization, even though we're a nonprofit, we model this work. We have wellness days. We are, there are things we're doing for our employees to ensure that they are caring for themselves. So we can't go out and profess it with it if we're not doing it ourselves. So we implement that as well in our organization.
Thank you. And we just had a question from the group, since it is very timely. Is there a framework, a structure and set of questions for healing circles that you all can point us to if we wanted to facilitate them at our school?
We create our own, we have our own curriculum, but if you're interested, I can put our email in the chat. You can email us and we can set up a time to talk about how we might be able to implement them in your school. We've created our own framework because we haven't found one that works well for teacher well-being. It's been done in clinical settings before, and healing circles have a lot of precedent in other spaces, but we haven't found a framework, so we've had to create our own.
Thank you for that. So with our next question, as we think about healing circles, and also how to think about the impact of trauma on our educators, this question is for Dr. Okoya and Isaiah. How have the larger issues of racial injustice in the country impacted educators of color and their experiences in the classroom, their schools, and even their districts? And we'll start with Isaiah.
Yeah, well, first, that's a great question. It's a loaded question. When I think of this question, I often, and I'm sorry, my dog is in the back, he might be snoring, so I apologize about that. I often think about the importance of, school to prison pipeline and how, so many marginalized groups are overlooked. I think about, we spoke about it earlier, we used to talk about achievement gap, but it's really about opportunity gap. And I think about myself as, someone who's a marginalized man. I grew up in a middle-class white framework. I went to schools, brick and mortar. I went to Columbia University. Every time I walked into Butler Library, I was oppressed. And some of that still is with me to this day, even, doing professional development for principals, teachers, it lives. And I think we don't always name systematic and structural racism and how it really perpetuates and has been maintained and evolved through this time. It is truly a mindset shift. And to, Dr. Montgomery spoke about this earlier, but in my school, in my former school, we became a trauma-informed school. We also implemented SEL. I saw people implementing social emotional learning throughout the country and throughout the world, and it's great, but it felt like it was a block instead of embedded in every single piece of every single content area. And it doesn't live by itself. And that work you teach to teachers, and teachers actually should be using the skills of being able to regulate, relate, and reason, and then teaching kids to do that. And so if you are an educator of color, you're coming with the baggage from that middle-class framework, the sense of urgency, that white supremacy culture, also with these deadlines, and not knowing how to do your job in the midst of a pandemic or multiple pandemics, when maybe somebody is outside in the street getting shot and no gun zone is going off on your phone. And so there are so many things. I think, to answer your question, we got to think about people's experiences and people's stories. And that is where we start. And we have to essentially meet people where they are.
Thank you.
I'm just pausing to let that wash over me, because Isaiah shared a number of gems and I don't want to just jump in. So this question is really heavy, especially as a Black woman, as a former Black teacher. I don't think I always knew, like you're saying, Isaiah, the ways in which I was continuing to enact white supremacy and uphold white supremacy characteristics in schools. And so I took a step back and really looked at what was happening. And so I think, just kind of to stick to the question a little bit, the ways in which these larger racial injustices have impacted classrooms and schools, I think about, there was the murder of George Floyd, the murder of Breonna Taylor, and then I think it's like to create a list of all of the incidences that have happened since then, the Buffalo school shooting and all of those things would be an exhaustive, really traumatic experience. So I'm not even going to do that. But what I will say is that students of color, educators of color, school leaders of color are managing themselves and experiencing primary trauma, racial trauma, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, collective trauma of the pandemic, and still expected to continue as usual. So for educators in schools, at the peak of the pandemic, when COVID-19 was disproportionately impacting their communities, what I was seeing is that the teachers in our communities were the ones who were losing parents and loved ones to COVID. Their spouses and partners were the people who had to go, essential workers. And so they were experiencing the pandemic at the same time as the rest of us, but were the statistics that we were seeing on the news. And we didn't pause and slow down to think about how that trauma, that compounded trauma, impacted people's humanity. And if we don't intervene now and figure out a way to connect their health outcomes in the future. I think something that gets looked over or glossed over is the ACEs study, which looks at adverse childhood experiences, was initially looking at obesity, which is a physical health outcome. And so we think about ACEs and adverse childhood experiences and trauma impacting mental health. We don't think about how that is linked to health disparities and physical health disparities as well. So I really want us to, in this moment, pause and think about how to optimize opportunities for connection, because our livelihood in the future, especially for people of color, literally depends on it, right? Our cells need to heal from the trauma that we continue to experience and the compounded trauma that we did experience in 2020 and, you know, the 100 years before that. So yeah, we could have an entire panel on this.
We actually, and before we move on, I wanted to see what either of our other panelists like to speak to this topic, as I know this has a significant impact on all of the work that we do.
Yeah, I can maybe just add, I think that what both Isaiah and Dr. Wenimo were both bringing up is this need to really integrate considerations about the different lived experiences of educators of color when we are crafting policies to support educator well-being. So for instance, I remember when we were first reporting on educator well-being back in 2021, we found that Black or African-American teachers were more likely to consider leaving the profession. And in media reports, we heard stories of racial battle fatigue, racial isolation, microaggressions in the workplace, in addition to all of the different lived experience and traumas that we just spoke about. And so in our most recent round of data collection, analysis, and reporting, we wanted to more deeply explore the experiences of educators of color. And we found that nearly half of principals of color and 1/3 of teachers of color experience racial discrimination at school. And of course, teachers and principals of different races and ethnicities experience different types of racial discrimination too. And so I think that provides us with another reminder that we can't just treat teachers of color as a single monolith, and we need to attend to all of these different experiences. And unsurprisingly, experiences of racial discrimination were linked with well-being indicators like depression, difficulty coping with job-related stress, burnout, feelings of lack of resilience, and they were also linked with educators' intentions to leave. And so I think this kind of just speaks to the need to make sure that we are making teaching and leading attractive professions for educators of color, making sure that they feel safe and a sense of belonging, as we've talked about, that culture of care is really important, and those connections in the school climate are really important. Just attending to all of that as we think about the different policies that we can craft in order to support these educators.
Thank you. Dr. Montgomery, anything to add?
I'm so glad that, I'm so glad you all brought this up, because the medical profession and the medical community is recognizing that racism is a driver for physical and mental health for Black people and other people of color. It is a major driver. And I'm so glad that it's coming up now and that we're recognizing it as a driver for health, because it actually validated me when I actually crumbled when the murder of George Floyd was made so visible in public. It impacted my own mental health and well-being. And it impacted how, I dealt with those everyday microaggressions and micro assaults that occur every day. And people aren't thinking about how it really impacts you daily. And so then when it's in your workplace and, you're being sent, all the Black children in the school, to help with their behavior because you happen to be a Black teacher, or those things that happen, go deal with that parent because you're better able to deal with them because you share the same cultural background. Those when you're being asked to speak for your race or speak for your folks because you're the one and only on the staff. These are things that happen, all the time to leaders and teachers of color. And it takes a toll mentally. And then we also know that when your mental health is being attacked, then your physical health is also impacted. And so I think it's really important for us to understand that as a whole, we have to do better around really removing unconscious bias issues and microaggressions and micro assaults from schools in total, not just in classroom towards students, because we're all, everybody's going through all these trainings, but are people really being held accountable to change their behaviors and to really shift their practices as a result of what they're learning. It's currently there's all these checkoffs. We hired an equity diversity person, it's a checkbox, but are we actually making a change that really results in how making a change in how we're grading and discipline practices and how we're hiring and the support we're providing our leaders? Is it really changing our practice? It's not enough to check the box anymore. It really is important that we make changes that are lasting and systemic.
Thank you. And I think it's really important that how you all mentioned, that place of care just beyond kind of checking if people are okay, but really thinking about the way that trauma occurs for everyone and how it looks differently. We did a webinar back in December of last year on racial battle fatigue, specifically for college students, but there's a lot of parallels between what that looks like in college age students, but also from the psychological mental health aspect, what that looks like for adults, that each day you do this. And, just to reference a question in the chat about dealing with people who think you're incompetent, I think you all brought up the concept of microaggressions and how just that creates that trauma as well. And those are like just those it's like a paper cut, and every time you wash your hands or do anything, all of those things happen. And so I think that is important. We're going to move into some of our audience questions. I recently saw someone raise their hand as a participant. If you have a question, please put it in our question and answer. Please put it in the chat. We have a few Hunt staff that are monitoring that, and we'll get to you on that. This question comes from Rachel Kaplan. And so I will pose this to Dr. Montgomery. The plan to shift policy so that expectations of teachers are managed and they are not overworked sounds wonderful in theory. What backup systems will be put in place to pick up the slack, such as substitute pools and more support staff? Where will the funds come to support these types of systems?
Thank you for asking that question. Every system has a way of making these decisions, right? The problem is there's no overall across the board way that we're addressing this problem. And so it is incumbent upon individual leaders at individual school sites and individual school systems to put in place practices. And so it really becomes a system of prioritizing our resources in a way that allows us to dedicate resources towards teacher wellness. And so often we have the martyr attitude, as I said before, which makes us put ourselves last. And so if we're asking a group of educators, where do we want to spend this amount of money? Do we want to spend this money on, after school supports for students, tutoring for students, supports for families, or teacher wellness? We oftentimes will choose the other things before we choose teacher wellness. And so it's important that we bring that discussion to the forefront and understand that you have to put the mask on ourselves. Like when we're in an airplane, we have to put our mask on ourselves before we put our mask on other people. And that's what we have to start driving to ourselves. So it's really incumbent upon us to ensure that we're putting ourselves as a major part of whatever we're going to decide for resources. So can I tell you like what things are going to be in place everywhere? No, but I can say that some districts are making a decision to do self-care, to add self-care days as a benefit, to also add these release times for, as you said, substitute pools, to have dedicated substitutes to ensure that teachers are being released and supported. So I think it's a matter of the education community coming together and putting together ideas and best practices and spreading those across the community.
Great, thank you. That is super helpful to really think about how these interventions really need to be individualized, but also thinking about how you can make this happen in your schools. This question will be for Ashley and Dr. Okoya. What responsibilities do teacher principal training and education programs have in fostering leadership that will support institutional well-being in educational environments? Do you know of programs in teachers' colleges that are innovative and effective in this area? How do we loop in the current and future policymakers to this conversation?
So I guess I might say, I think that just given the importance of school climate, and as we've been talking a lot about that culture of care, I think that is something that school leaders definitely have the power to cultivate within their schools. And I think that that kind of leads to this kind of like importance that leader preparation program should be placing on developing these school climates where people are really able to connect with each other and build relationships with each other and cultivate that community of care. And so I think that's a place where principals can continue to get ongoing training and pre-service training in order to build those skills, to build that school climate. I don't know of any schools in particular that are doing this particularly well, but I'll let Dr. Wenimo speak to this question, and maybe she has some additional things to add.
Yeah, so I think that there's definitely a lot of work for education preparation programs to do in this area and to center this work. I will say though, I teach a class at Teachers College, Columbia University, as I teach one module of part of a larger class on anti-racist pedagogy and healing-centered education that centers teachers and also includes the healing of students as part of that module. So students who take that class all get that part as part of their training, and I'm working to try to get that to be more central to pre-service training for teachers, because that's just a huge area of advocacy for me. And similarly, I work at NYU Metro Center. We're focused on racial equity and focus on incorporating an equity lens. And that's a lens that we're trying to bring there, is how do we really create healing-centered schools, and that if we want to do meaningful, sustaining equity work, we have to care for people and support them. But I will say that your question is well prompted, and I hope that you keep asking that, because I think that teacher ed programs do need to do a better job of making sure that caring for oneself, caring for one community becomes a skill set of a good teacher. Not just something that you consider as an afterthought, but something that is a skill that you need in order to sustain you in this work. And then another thing that I will say is that there are like a lot of alternate preparation and in-service preparation programs. So one of the folks that we're partnering with is the Black Teacher Collaborative, and they are thinking about well-being of teachers in part of their community as well, and looking to bring us in to support well-being. There are a number of others as well that support Black teachers and other teachers of color that are thinking about well-being. Educolor is another one, thinking about well-being as central to their work. So I think the work is moving forward, but we do need to continue to ask these questions, because we are undoing and unlearning a lot of the way that we've been taught educators need to show up in schools, and what are the skill sets of a good teacher.
Thank you so much. This has all been so helpful, and we've talked a lot about teachers. However, what we haven't talked about a lot is the impact that this has on students. And so for our final question, I'd love to hear from each of our panelists. What, if any, is the impact on students when educator well-being is prioritized? What is the greater impact or larger impact on the school community when we prioritize the wellness and well-being of our teachers and school leaders? And we will start with Ashley, and then go to Isaiah, then Dr. Okoye, and we will end with Dr. Montgomery.
Sure. And so prior research has shown that teacher wellness and mental health are connected with the quality of students' learning environments and also with student outcomes. So for instance, there's been some research that has found that when teachers are stressed and burnt out, kids get stressed out too. And of course, teacher stress and well-being has been linked to teacher turnover, which also has links to student achievement. And in particular, our research has found that Hispanic teachers had lower rates of well-being than non-Hispanic teachers. The teachers of color were more likely to say that they were planning to leave their jobs than white teachers, which is also consistent with pre-pandemic research. And I think this is especially concerning when you think about how teachers of color are already underrepresented in the workforce. And especially when you think about the benefits that students of color in particular receive when they have a teacher of color. And so I think this kind of all points to the impact that teacher wellness has on all these different aspects of students' learning experiences in schools.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. That's a great question. I agree with everything that Ashley said. Just thinking about this idea of one being a rising tide and the power and influence. If we continue, and this is for the last question as well, if we continue to name it and say what's hard with love and really talk about our number one priority being wellness, and Dr. Canty, you spoke about this earlier, the difference between being okay and being well. If we read even Bettina Love's book, Abolitionist Teaching, there's a chapter that really talks about, wellness as an educator. And we kind of need to make this our number one priority, shout it out. But even James Comer talks about, putting wellness at the forefront creates positive culture for all. And if you have strong adults who are learning and feel comfortable, you'll have strong student outcomes, which in turn pushes to strong communities. And so it's a trickle down effect. And so, yeah.
I think it's my turn. So yeah, we all agree with each other. I feel like we could have a conversation for, this is definitely an echo chamber of people. And I feel really grateful to be part of this community. But the thing that I would add to this is, well, because educators of color were not meant to be in the school system that exists in the first place, their advancement and their well-being and their sustainability determines the sustainability and design of a system that works for students of color, right? So schools were not designed for students of color. They were not designed for Black and Brown students for them to be successful. They were not designed for educators of color to teach in. So I think a lot about how systems are designed and who they're designed for. And we would be done doing equity work if we designed every intervention system and space for Black, trans, disabled young women, and we'd just be done. We'd be like, sorry, like we could stop having this conversation. So I think that the future of our state, the state of education, is dependent on our ability to sustain and design systems that support, care for, love on, and really promote the well-being of educators of color and thus their students. So I just can't punctuate that point enough, how important this is and how underemphasized it has been prior to this moment.
And last but certainly not least, Dr. Montgomery.
As far as I know, research hasn't changed. Teacher knowledge and skill is still the single most important factor to improving student outcomes. That probably will never change. And so teachers remain at the center of this work, and those who support teachers, leaders, are connected to that as well. But we can't get better at doing what we do if we're not caring for ourselves and we're not healthy, both mentally and physically. And so to the degree that I'm feeling mentally and physically well is the degree that you're going to get the best work from me. And so I think we need to ensure that teachers are well cared for, leaders are well cared for, so that they can bring their best selves to work every day, so that then they can then create environments that allow students to thrive. I really appreciate what all of the folks on this panel today bringing to this forefront, and really appreciate what Dr. Okoya just said around ensuring, that we are creating a space that is conducive to having our students thrive, in particular our Black and Brown students. If we can create spaces where they can thrive, then we can create spaces where everyone can thrive. And I think the same holds true for educators. If we can create spaces where Black male teachers are thriving, then we can create a space where everyone can thrive, both mentally, physically, and healthily. And in addition to that, if we're also broadening and letting the ripple of that go out into the community to families where they're feeling welcomed, they're feeling cared for, and they can thrive. We're working with our community assets and agencies, organizations to ensure that the entire community is health and wellness is taken care of. Then it's all creating an entire ecosystem where people can thrive, both physically, mentally, and academically.
Thank you all for your time today. There are so many intersections of this conversation and a lot of the work that we do at the Hunt Institute. So I'm always so excited to be surrounded by a room full of experts who are able to share some really good points, but also best practices and how we move this forward. And so I appreciate all of you and your time today, and for all of you that attended this afternoon. Just to let you know, the Hunt Institute does about 4 to 6 webinars each month. Our content teams provide support on those. So our next one will be on Wednesday, August 31st, and it is the role of community colleges and post-secondary attainment, and that is from our higher ed team. Our early childhood team will be talking about the state of America's childcare industry, September 6th. And the race and education team will be back in partnership with our K-12 team to talk about the role of teacher diversity in decriminalizing Latinx girls. We're really excited because one of our 1 Million Teachers of Color partners, Latinx Ed, or Latinos for Education, will be there supporting the program and also participating. I will put a link in the chat that will go out to everyone that will provide insight on our upcoming events. And so sorry we did not get to all of your questions today. We know that this conversation could go on, but we are so grateful for our panelists. All of their social media and information you can find on the Hunt Institute's LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. So reach out to them, sit under their trees of knowledge, and support the work that they're doing, because we know without you all and without our policy work, we're not able to make strides in increasing and retaining teachers and educators and also leaders, and also supporting their mental health. So thank you all so much. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon, and we hope to see you again on one of our Hunt webinars. Chairman, can you see the button where it says end webinar?